Imagine a world consumed by steel and fire, a time when borders shifted like sand dunes, and a knock on the door might mean the end of everything you knew. It is the year 1055. Your village is suddenly overrun, your life upended in a heartbeat. What horrors await a woman caught in the chaotic grip of war, stripped of her home, her family, her very freedom? What unspeakable paths might her future take when the enemy decides her fate? Number 1. The absolute annihilation of identity, family, and hope. The dust settled, slow and heavy, on the ruins of what had once been a bustling market street. The shouts had died down, replaced by the crackle of distant fires and the low, mournful cries of those left behind. For Elara, a young woman who had watched her entire world crumble in a single, brutal morning, the silence was the worst torment of all. It was the silence of loss, an emptiness that echoed louder than any scream. She had seen her father fall, defending their home with a rusty axe against the invaders' polished blades. She had seen her mother, pale and trembling, dragged away by rough hands, her desperate gaze meeting Elara's for a fleeting, agonizing second before she vanished into the chaos. Her younger brother, barely more than a boy, was simply gone, swallowed by the terror. Elara herself had been seized, her struggles useless against the strength of her captor. She was just one among many, a piece of plunder in the hands of men who saw only conquest and spoil. But unlike some who might have been destined for immediate toil or a quick sale, Elara's fate was to be utterly stripped, not just of her possessions, but of her very essence. She was taken to a temporary holding place, a makeshift camp where other terrified women and children huddled together, their faces bruised and tears streaked. There was no distinction here, no recognition of who they had been: a baker's daughter, a weaver, a noblewoman. They were simply captives, their individual histories reduced to a single shared trauma. The initial shock had given way to a chilling numbness. Elara found herself unable to speak, unable to think beyond the immediate, crushing weight of the present. Her mind replayed the last moments of her life before, the scent of fresh bread from her mother's oven, the sound of her father's laughter, the way the sunlight used to filter through the leaves of the old oak tree in their yard. Now those memories felt like treasures from a lost world, impossibly far away. She clung to them fiercely, as if letting go would erase her entirely. The grim reality of her captivity chipped away at them, day by relentless day. The journey was long, exhausting, and filled with a constant, gnawing fear. They marched for days, then weeks, through unfamiliar lands. The faces around her changed. Some women grew ill and were left by the roadside, their fates unspoken. Others were taken away, destined for a different, equally grim purpose. Elara watched them go, each departure a further severing of any remaining connection to humanity. Her identity, so carefully constructed over years, was dissolving. Her name, Elara, was rarely spoken, replaced by a generic woman or slave. Her family, the very bedrock of her existence, was gone. She was a refugee in the harshened sense of the word, not just displaced, but utterly disconnected. This was not merely about being captured. It was about the systematic obliteration of everything that made her her. Her language, the familiar sounds of her native tongue, became a liability, a barrier to communication with her new masters. She heard strange dialects, rough and guttural, that grated on her ears. The food was unfamiliar, the customs alien. She was a ghost in a foreign land, haunting the edges of a world that refused to acknowledge her existence. The psychological toll was immense. Grief, raw and untamed, was a constant companion. It mingled with a profound sense of disorientation. She had once known where she belonged, what her role was, who she was. Now she was nothing. This was more insidious than a physical wound, because it attacked the very core of her being. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The names of her family members began to feel distant, like characters in a story she had once heard, not flesh and blood people she had loved and lost. She fought against this erosion, clutching at fragments of memory, whispering their names to herself in the darkest hours of the night. But the constant pressure of her new, brutal reality was relentless. The threat of violence, the unending toil, the sheer loneliness of being completely unknown and uncared for in a hostile world slowly, surely wore her down. In the medieval world of 1055, a woman's identity was inextricably linked to her family, her village, her status. She was someone's daughter, someone's wife, a member of a specific community, part of a defined social order. To be ripped from all of that was to be utterly unmade. Historical accounts, though scarce and often written by men, hint at the profound desolation felt by such women. Chronicle might mention the taking of womenfolk as spoils of war, but it rarely delves into the internal devastation. Yet we know from other periods that such rootlessness could lead to a spiritual death, a profound despair that robbed individuals of their will to live. For Elara, the days were a continuous struggle against this internal surrender. She saw women around her who had simply given up, their eyes vacant, their movements robotic. They had become shells, their spirits extinguished. This was the ultimate terror, to be alive yet cease to be oneself. Her captors cared nothing for her past. They cared only for her utility. She was put to work, scrubbing floors, carrying water, tending to animals. The monotonous physical labor, while exhausting, offered a fleeting distraction from the abyss within. But at night, when the camp fell silent, the memories flooded back, sharper and more painful than ever. Faces of her family, the sounds of their voices, the warmth of their touch, they taunted her from the depths of her mind. She yearned for them for the simple comfort of being known and loved, but there was no hope of return. The distance, both physical and emotional, was too vast. Her village, her home, her family, they were all gone, consumed by the flames of war. She was a stranger in a strange land, utterly alone, stripped of all that defined her. This was the ultimate fate of a woman captured in conflict in 1055, the absolute annihilation of her identity, her family, and any shred of hope for a return to a life she once knew. It was a living death, a profound and inescapable exile from herself. Number 2, the unspeakable trauma of repeated sexual violence. The air in the makeshift encampment was thick with the stench of sweat, fear, and unwashed bodies. Anya, a young woman from a small farming village nestled in the rolling hills of what is now southern Germany, the moment of capture had been a blur of terror and confusion. Family had been scattered, her home set alight, and she herself had been seized amidst the chaos. Now she was just one more captive, her hands bound, her spirit already fractured by the sudden, brutal rupture of her peaceful life. The horrors she had already endured were merely the prelude to an even deeper, more insidious torment. In the grim reality of 1055, conflict was not just about territory or power. It was also about the assertion of dominance, and the spoils of war often included the bodies of the vanquished. For women, this grim reality frequently manifested as systematic sexual violence. Anya learned quickly that her body was no longer her own. Fear was a constant knot in her stomach, a cold dread that never left her. Every shadow, every approaching footstep, every rough voice sent a jolt of terror through her. She tried to make herself invisible, to shrink into the corners of the crowded tent where she was held with other women, but there was no escape. The assaults were not isolated incidents. They were repeated, a grim rhythm of violation that chipped away at her soul. Sometimes it was one man, sometimes several. They cared nothing for her cries, her pleas, her humanity. She was an object, a symbol of their victory, a vessel for their brutality. Physical pain was sharp and visceral, leaving her body bruised and aching, a roadmap of the horrors inflicted upon her. But the internal wounds were far deeper, more pervasive. Shame, an overwhelming, suffocating shame, wrapped itself around her like a suffocating shroud. In her culture, a woman's purity was highly prized, her worth often tied to her virginity or her fidelity. To be violated in this manner repeatedly was not just a physical assault, it was a profound spiritual and social defilement, threatening to strip her of any future standing or acceptance. She felt dirtied, corrupted, fundamentally broken. The world had turned upside down, and the very concept of safety, of innocence, had been irrevocably shattered. Her ability to trust, even to trust herself, withered and died. Every touch, even from another captive woman offering a small gesture of comfort, felt like a threat. She recoiled from human contact, her body a battlefield of pain and memory. Her mind became a chaotic mess of flashbacks and constant vigilance. Sleep offered no escape, only nightmares that replayed the traumatic events with chilling fidelity. She stopped eating, her stomach churning with nausea. She stopped speaking, her voice choked by a silent scream. She was hollowed out, a ghost trapped within her own skin. This systematic degradation was a common, if rarely documented, aspect of medieval warfare. While chronicles might praise brave knights and victorious battles, they seldom detailed the brutal realities faced by women. Yet evidence from legal codes, religious texts, and the few surviving women's testimonies from later periods points to the widespread nature of such violence. Conquerors used it as a tool of terror, to break the will of the vanquished, to assert absolute control, and to demoralize the population. Anya, it was a weapon used directly against her, reducing her to something less than human. She was not just a prisoner, she was a victim, stripped of her dignity, her agency, her very self. The long-term consequences of such trauma in 1055 were devastating. If she survived the immediate physical injuries and the risk of disease, Anya would face a life irrevocably altered. She might become pregnant, a cruel and constant reminder of her violation, a child born of horror in a world that would view both mother and child with suspicion or scorn. Chances of finding a husband, of returning to any semblance of normal life in her own society, would be severely diminished. She would be an outcast, marked by her suffering. The psychological scars would never truly heal. She would likely suffer from profound anxiety, depression, and a deep-seated fear of men. The world would forever be a dangerous place, and trust an impossible luxury. She would carry the weight of her trauma, silent and unseen, a constant companion in every waking moment. Anya's spirit, once vibrant and hopeful, was slowly dying. She would often stare blankly ahead, her eyes seeing not the grimy tent walls, but the unspeakable images branded onto her mind. The sounds of men's laughter, the creak of wagon wheels, the unfamiliar smells of the camp, all became triggers, plunging her back into moments of stark terror. She was a prisoner not just of her captors, but of her own shattered mind. The systematic, repeated sexual violence had not just harmed her body, it had utterly shattered her soul, leaving her with an unspeakable trauma that would haunt her every breath, a living death for a woman captured in the brutal conflicts of 1055. Number 3. The unwilling vow of forced marriage. Eliza had always imagined her wedding day. It would be in the village church, bathed in the soft glow of candles, her family gathered, her dress, a fine creation of soft linen and simple embroidery, rustling as she walked down the aisle to meet a man she loved, a man her father had chosen for her, a man from their own community. Life in their quiet valley, though challenging, held the promise of continuity, of generations living on the same land, under the same sky. That dream, however, was shattered the day the foreign knights rode into their valley, their banners stark against the horizon, their intentions clear. Eliza was young, attractive, and of a good, albeit modest, family. This made her a valuable prize. She was not immediately violated like some others. Instead, she was singled out, her beauty a curse and a strange form of protection. She was brought before the conquering lord, a man named Berthold, whose eyes held a predatory gleam. He was older, scarred, and his power was absolute. He had taken their land, their people, and now he decided he would take her. The decree was blunt, delivered through a frightened interpreter. She would become his wife, not a concubine, not a servant, but his wife. This was a twisted form of victory, a way to cement his claim to the conquered territory and to integrate the vanquished into his new domain. For Eliza, it was a sentence far worse than death. The concept of forced marriage in medieval conflict was a complex and horrifying reality. For women of noble birth, it was often a strategic tool, a way to forge alliances or consolidate power through the absorption of conquered lands and bloodlines. For women like Eliza, from prosperous but not aristocratic families, it could be a means of securing local control, of asserting ownership over the land by owning one of its daughters. It was a cruel mockery of the sacred institution of marriage, stripping it of any love, consent, or shared future. Eliza's family, those who remained alive and uncaptured, could do nothing. They were powerless, their pleas for mercy met with a brutal shrug. She was a pawn, a symbol, a breeding vessel for the conqueror's line, meant to produce heirs who would solidify his hold on the region. The wedding itself was a grim charade. There were no joyful hymns, no celebratory feasting, only the heavy silence of despair and the watchful eyes of her new master's men. She wore a dress not of her choosing, but one taken from a looted chest, feeling its unfamiliar textures against her skin like a brand. Her hands trembled as she was forced to repeat the vows, a hollow echo in the unfamiliar chapel. Her heart screamed a silent refusal, but her lips moved, obediently, mechanically. She was bound not by love, but by force, by the sheer, overwhelming power of her captor. Her new life was a gilded cage, if it was gilded at all. She was Lady Berthold, mistress of the castle, but she was also a prisoner within its very walls. She was watched constantly, her movements restricted, her words monitored. She was forbidden from speaking her native language, from practicing her own customs. from any contact with the remnants of her former world. Her identity was being systematically erased, replaced by the role imposed upon her. Constant violation was not always physical in the same way as the previous scenario, but it was deeply, profoundly psychological. Her body was now the property of her captor, and her mind was a battleground. She was expected to perform the duties of a wife, to manage the household, to entertain guests, to bear children. Each act was a forced performance, a betrayal of herself. She learned to plaster a blank expression on her face, to move through her days like an automaton. Physical intimacy, devoid of consent or affection, was a cold, alien act that left her feeling empty and used. She yearned for a genuine touch, a kind word, a moment of true connection, but found only the stark reality of her servitude. Fear of not producing a male heir was a constant shadow, a pressure that weighed heavily on her. If she failed, her fate could be even worse: repudiation, a return to utter destitution, or even death. Her every breath was a calculation, a careful navigation of her husband's moods and expectations. She was living a lie, playing a part, her true self hidden deep beneath layers of forced compliance and silent suffering. The women of her own village, those who had survived, looked upon her with a mixture of pity and resentment. She was one of them, yet she was now one of the conquerors, a symbol of their subjugation. She was isolated, caught between two worlds belonging to neither. 1055, such a forced marriage was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a political statement, a brutal absorption of one culture by another. For Eliza, it meant the loss of her agency, her autonomy, her future. She would bear children who were half stranger, half conqueror, children who would never truly know her own lineage or heritage. She was a woman who had given an unwilling vow, trapped in a life she never chose, bound by chains far stronger than iron, the chains of circumstance, power, and a forced union that stripped her of all hope for genuine connection and belonging. She was a constant reminder of conquest, a living testament to the brutal realities of war, forever bound to a man who had stolen her life. Number 4, the degradation of public humiliation and spectacle. The journey had been long, arduous, and filled with despair for Serafina, a seamstress from a besieged city in what is now northern Italy. She had witnessed the fall of her home, the desperate screams of its defenders, and the swift, brutal entry of the conquering army. Captured along with hundreds of others, she was not destined for immediate sale or private enslavement. Instead, her fate, and the fate of many like her, was to serve a darker purpose, to be a living warning, a chilling display of the conqueror's might, a spectacle of utter humiliation for the vanquished. Public degradation was a potent psychological weapon in medieval warfare. It wasn't just about punishing individuals. It was about breaking the spirit of an entire community, about demonstrating absolute power and crushing any hope of resistance. Serafina found herself forced to march, not towards a distant camp, but towards the very heart of the enemy's triumphant entry into a captured city, or even back to their own capital. The purpose was clear: to showcase their victory and to instill fear. Preparations for this grim procession were designed to maximize shame. Serafina, along with other captured women, was stripped of any remaining personal possessions, her modest garments replaced by coarse, ill-fitting rags. Her hair, once carefully braided, was shorn or allowed to fall tangled and wild. Her face, along with others, was smeared with dirt or even worse substances, distorting her features, making her unrecognizable even to herself. There was an intentional effort to dehumanize, to turn individuals into grotesque caricatures of themselves. Her hands were bound, not tightly to inflict pain, but loosely enough to allow her to hold a symbol of her city's defeat, perhaps a broken banner pole, or a crude wooden effigy representing its fallen strength. Then came the procession itself. It was not a silent march of sorrow, but a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to be witnessed by thousands. They were forced to walk, not in silence, but to endure the jeers and taunts of the victorious populace lining the streets. Rotten vegetables, mud, and even human waste were hurled at them. Each impact was a physical assault, but the real pain was in the searing shame. Serafina felt her cheeks burn, not from exertion, but from the unbearable weight of 1,000 mocking eyes. She tried to avert her gaze, to disappear into herself, but there was no escape. Every taunt, every laugh, every piece of refuse that struck her was a blow to her dignity, stripping away her last remnants of self-respect. The men of the conquering army, parading proudly on horseback, roared with laughter, their triumph underscored by the abject humiliation of their captives. The women were forced to walk slowly, painfully, under the scorching sun or in the biting cold, their bare feet cut by the rough stones of the street. They were a living testament to their city's failure, a public display of submission. The emotional toll was profound. Serafina felt her spirit crack. To be so utterly exposed, so utterly degraded in front of strangers, was a violation that cut deeper than any whip. It was a systematic attempt to break her will, to make her internalize her defeat, to make her believe that she was truly worthless. Historical accounts, though again, often focusing on the grandeur of the victors, sometimes mention the parades of captives. In the Byzantine Empire, for instance, victorious emperors would hold elaborate triumphs where prisoners of war, including women, were paraded through the streets of Constantinople, often in chains or with symbols of their humiliation. While 1055 predates many of the Grand Crusader triumphs, the underlying principle of displaying human spoils of war was ancient and widespread across various cultures and conflicts. From the Viking raids that took captives to the feudal wars across fragmented European kingdoms, the public display of the vanquished was a potent form of psychological warfare. For Serafina, the memory of that march would forever be etched into her mind. It was a trauma that transcended physical pain, attacking her very sense of self. She might survive the ordeal, might even eventually escape or be ransomed, but she would forever carry the invisible scars of that public humiliation. Echoes of the jeering crowds, the feeling of the thrown dirt, the burning shame, these would haunt her dreams and shadow her waking hours. She would forever be cautious, wary, her trust in humanity shattered. The world would feel like a stage where she was always being judged, always exposed. Even if she later found a measure of peace, the public degradation would remain a defining moment, a deep and unhealing wound. It was a deliberate act of psychological torture designed to break the individual and to terrorize the community. Serafina's public humiliation was not just an event, it was a permanent disfigurement of her spirit, a crushing blow to her dignity, leaving her with a profound and lasting sense of worthlessness, a grim legacy for a woman captured and subjected to the brutality of medieval conflict in 1055. Number 5. The slow agony of neglect and starvation. For Isolde, the initial terror of capture had been a sharp, sudden shock. Terror that followed was a slow, creeping horror, a relentless descent into suffering that attacked her body from within. She was a village healer, knowledgeable in herbs and remedies, accustomed to the rhythms of life and death, but nothing could have prepared her for the grim reality of being a prisoner in a medieval stronghold in 1055. She was one of many captured during a raid on her frontier settlement, deemed valuable enough to be held for ransom or future service, but not important enough to be treated with any semblance of care. Isolde and the other captives were thrown into a dark, damp dungeon, a stone cell deep within the castle walls. The air was cold and stale, thick with the smell of mold, damp earth, and human waste. There was no light save for a narrow slit high up near the ceiling, through which a sliver of weak daylight occasionally pierced the gloom. The initial days were marked by desperate pleas, by the sounds of women weeping and children crying. But as the days turned into weeks, the cries diminished, replaced by a quiet, resigned despair. The neglect was systematic. Food was sparse and of the poorest quality: moldy bread, thin, watery gruel, barely enough to sustain life. Water was even scarcer, often stagnant and tasting of iron. Isolde, with her knowledge of the human body, understood the grim trajectory they were on. Malnutrition began to take its toll, slowly, agonizingly. Her body, once strong and capable, began to waste away. Her skin grew sallow and translucent, her bones becoming painfully prominent. Her hair, once thick and lustrous, grew brittle and began to fall out in clumps. Every movement became an immense effort, each breath a struggle. Disease, a silent, pervasive killer, soon followed. Cramped conditions, lack of sanitation, and weakened immune systems created a fertile ground for illness. Fevers swept through the cell, leaving captives shivering and delirious. Dysentery, a horrifying affliction in an age without proper hygiene, spread rapidly, weakening bodies even further. Isolde, despite her healing knowledge, was powerless. She had no herbs, no clean water, no tools to combat the rampant infections. All she could do was watch, helpless, as those around her grew weaker, their labored breathing turning shallow, their eyes dimming with the approach of death. She witnessed women succumbing to the cold, their bodies growing stiff in the corners of the cell. She heard the hacking coughs of others, their lungs failing. She saw the glazed eyes of those consumed by fever, their delirium a mercy before their final breaths. The psychological impact of this slow, agonizing death was immense. Hope, a fragile thing at the best of times, withered and died. Day was a grim calculation of survival, a battle against the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and the pervasive chill that seeped into her bones. Her mind, once sharp, became foggy with hunger and exhaustion. She struggled to remember details of her past life, the faces of her family, the warmth of her home. The world shrunk to the confines of her cell, to the constant pain in her belly, to the desperate thirst. This was a common fate for many captives in medieval warfare. Sieges often led to mass starvation, both for the besieged and for those captured. Without proper provisions, or if the captors simply lacked the resources or the will to feed them, prisoners were left to starve. The concept of humanitarian care for prisoners of war was centuries away. They were burdens, mouths to feed, unless they could be quickly ransomed or put to work. If they fell ill or became too weak, they were often simply left to die. Historical records from the period, such as those detailing sieges and subsequent prisoner handling, often describe the dire conditions that led to widespread death from starvation and disease among captives. Isolde clung to life with a fierce, desperate will, even as her body betrayed her. She watched her own hands, bony and frail, and could barely recognize them. Pain of hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at her insides, distorting her thoughts. She found herself obsessing over food, dreaming of simple meals, of the taste of fresh bread and clean water. These dreams were cruel, offering a fleeting comfort only to vanish upon waking, leaving her to face the harsh reality of her emaciated body and the silent suffering of her fellow captives. Degradation of neglect was not swift and brutal, but insidious and relentless. Stripped away her strength, her health, her very humanity, leaving her a skeletal shadow of her former self. Even if she were eventually released, the physical and psychological damage would be permanent. Her body would bear the marks of starvation, her immune system would be compromised, and her memory of the dungeon's slow agony would haunt her. She would forever carry the fear of hunger, the knowledge of profound helplessness. For Isolde and countless women like her in 1055, being captured often meant a slow, agonizing descent into a living death, where the ultimate enemy was not the captor's blade, but the relentless march of hunger, disease, and the crushing weight of utter neglect. Number 6. The erasing terror of forced conversion. Lyra had lived her entire life steeped in the ancient traditions of her people, nestled in a small community on the fringes of a vast empire, where old gods still held sway in the forests and the river. Faith was woven into every aspect of her existence, the songs she sang, the rituals she performed, the stories her grandmother told around the fire. It was her anchor, her identity, her connection to her ancestors and the very land itself. Then came the raiders, not just conquerors of land, but crusaders of faith, driven by a fervent belief that their one true God must reign supreme. In the tumultuous world of 1055, religious zeal often fueled conflict, and for women captured in such wars, the battle was not just for their lives, but for their very souls. Lyra was taken, along with other women and children, from her ravaged village. Their new masters were fervent Christians, their crosses emblazoned on their banners, their priests accompanying their armies. Captors saw Lyra's pagan faith as heresy, a dark ignorance that needed to be purged. For them, it was not enough to conquer her body. They sought to conquer her spirit, to bring her into the light of their God. This was a form of violence as profound as any physical torment, a systematic attempt to erase her internal world, her spiritual foundation. The process of forced conversion was insidious and relentless. Initially, it began with demands to cease their traditional practices. No more whispered prayers to the forest spirits, no more ancient chants by the river. Any defiance was met with swift, brutal punishment, a beating, a denial of food, or worse. Lyra watched in terror as older women who clung fiercely to their beliefs were singled out for harsher treatment, their cries a warning. Fear became a powerful motivator. Then came the indoctrination. Priests and monks, grim-faced and unyielding, began to preach to the captives. They spoke of sin and salvation, of a burning hell for those who refused their God, and a glorious heaven for those who embraced him. Lyra, who understood little of their complex doctrines, heard only the threat, the promise of eternal damnation if she resisted. She was forced to attend services, to listen to sermons in a language she barely understood, to kneel before their crucifixes to learn their prayer. Each forced act felt like a betrayal of her ancestors, a wrenching departure from all she had ever known. Her old faith, once vibrant and comforting, became a secret, a dangerous memory she dared not acknowledge openly. She would whisper old prayers in the darkest hours of the night, burying her face in the coarse blankets, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. But even these private acts became fraught with fear. What if she was discovered? What if her thoughts were somehow known? Constant vigilance, the suppression of her true self, gnawed at her mind. She felt a profound emptiness, a spiritual void where her rich inner world once resided. Historical examples of forced conversion abound throughout the Middle Ages, especially at the frontiers of Christian and Islamic expansion, or during periods of internal religious zeal. In the Iberian Peninsula, during the Reconquista, Muslim and Jewish populations faced immense pressure to convert. In the Baltic Crusades, pagan peoples were forcibly converted. While 1055 might predate some of the major Crusader campaigns, the religious motivations for war and the subsequent imposition of faith upon the conquered were already well established. For women, who often held significant roles in transmitting cultural and religious knowledge within families, this pressure was particularly acute. Forced severing of their ties to ancestral beliefs was not just a theological change, it was a profound cultural and personal loss. Lyra witnessed women around her, broken by fear and despair, openly embracing the new faith, seeking comfort in its rituals, or simply succumbing to the relentless pressure. Some found genuine solace, others became empty vessels, their faces blank. Lyra struggled. Her heart clung to the familiar spirits of the forest, the warmth of her grandmother's stories. But her mind, battered by constant threats and the grim examples of others, slowly began to give way. She began to repeat the new prayers, to cross herself, to feign devotion. Each act was a small death, a further erasure of who she was. The erasure of her religious identity was also the erasure of her culture, her community, her sense of belonging. The very stories that connected her to her family, to her land, to her people, were now forbidden. She was no longer Lyra, the daughter of the forest, the keeper of old ways. She was being remade into someone else, a convert stripped of her spiritual heritage. This created an immense internal conflict, a schism within her soul. She was living a lie, a constant performance of a faith that was not her own, all while her true self withered in the shadows. The long-term consequences of forced conversion were devastating. Even if Lyra survived physically, she would carry the scars of this spiritual violation. She might live out her days outwardly conforming, but internally she would be a woman divided, haunted by the loss of her true faith. Children, if she had any, would be raised in the new religion, further severing the ties to her own heritage. She would forever be a stranger to herself, a woman whose soul had been conquered, leaving her with an enduring sense of emptiness, a profound loss of self, and the chilling realization that her very essence had been taken from her in the brutal conflicts of 1055. Number 7. The unsettling fate of enslavement. Miriam had always known what her future held. She was a weaver, skillful with loom and thread, destined to marry the son of a neighboring farmer and live out her days in the familiar rhythm of her small coastal village. The world of 1055 was a patchwork of warring fiefdoms and raiding parties, and her village, strategically located near a trade route, became a target. One brutal dawn, her life, and the lives of countless others, shattered. Miriam found herself captured, her hands bound, her future ripped away. This was not a quick execution or a forced marriage to a local lord. Her fate was the pervasive, crushing reality of enslavement. Slavery in the medieval world was not always the large-scale plantation system that would emerge centuries later. In 1055, it was a varied and widespread practice, fueled by conquest, debt, and trade. For a woman captured in conflict, enslavement meant the complete loss of freedom, autonomy, and human dignity. Miriam was just one more piece of plunder, her value assessed not by her spirit or her skills, but by her physical strength, her age, and her appearance. She was a commodity, no different from the livestock or the captured goods. The journey was the first ordeal. Marched for days, then weeks, often with insufficient food and water, Miriam endured exhaustion, hunger, and the constant threat of violence from her guards. She saw women fall by the wayside, left to die or picked off by wolves. She saw others beaten for lagging behind. She felt her body grow weak, her spirit slowly dimming with each passing mile. They arrived at a bustling market, a cacophony of foreign tongues and strange sights, where she was paraded and inspected like an animal. Teeth were checked, her limbs prodded, her body examined for any defects. The humiliation was profound. The knowledge that her very being was being appraised for its utility was a crushing weight. She was sold, not once, but twice, to different masters. Her first master, a rough warrior, put her to work in a harsh, outdoor camp, performing backbreaking labor, hauling timber and tending to animals. The sun beat down relentlessly, her skin cracked and burned, and her muscles ached constantly. Her hands, once nimble with thread, became calloused and raw. She was given the barest minimum to survive, her days a monotonous cycle of toil and sleep, punctuated by fear. There was no rest, no reprieve, only the endless demands of her new life. Every moment was controlled, every decision made for her. She was not allowed to speak her own language, her voice stifled by the harsh reality of her situation. She was no longer Miriam, the weaver, she was merely slave. Her second master, a wealthy merchant, offered a different, but equally crushing, form of servitude. She was taken to his bustling household, a complex web of servants, concubines, and family members. Here her labor was domestic cleaning, cooking, grinding grain, endless hours of preparation and scrubbing. While not as physically brutal as the warrior's camp, the constant pressure of unseen eyes, the arbitrary cruelty of a mistress, and the lack of any personal space or privacy wore away at her. She was always on call, always observing, always fearing a misstep that could lead to severe punishment. She slept on a thin mat on the cold floor, her dreams haunted by the life she had lost. The psychological toll was immense. The loss of her freedom was a constant, gnawing pain. She yearned for the simple act of choosing where to walk, what to eat, when to sleep. She yearned for privacy, for a moment of solitude where she could simply be herself, but there was none. Her days were a blur of enforced activity, her nights a battle against despair. She struggled with a profound sense of dehumanization. Her identity, her dreams, her aspirations, all had been stripped away. She was a tool, a possession, her very existence defined by her servitude. She saw other enslaved women around her, their faces blank, their spirits broken. She fought against becoming like them, desperately clinging to fragments of her past, whispering her own name to herself in the darkest hours. Historical accounts from the medieval period, from the Viking slave trade that extended across northern Europe to the major slave markets in places like Venice and across the Mediterranean, attest to the pervasive nature of this institution. Women were frequently captured and sold, particularly those seen as desirable for domestic labor, concubinage, or even as skilled craftswomen. The concept of human rights was alien to the time. A captured person was often considered the property of the captor, to be used or sold as they saw fit. Miriam's enslavement was a life sentence, one that robbed her not just of her present, but of her future. She would never marry the farmer's son, never weave her own beautiful cloth again, never return to her village. Children, if she had any, would be born into servitude, their fates bound to the will of her master. She would live out her days in a state of perpetual bondage, her every action dictated, her every desire suppressed. The unsettling fate of enslavement for a woman captured in conflict in 1055 was a slow, grinding destruction of the self, leaving her with no hope of liberation, her life reduced to ceaseless, unrewarded toil, a perpetual prisoner of circumstance and the brutal whim of her owner.